Hi everyone, I'm here with my mom and today we're going to answer some common questions about sourdough with freshly milled flour. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go for it.
What do you like to make with sourdough?
I use freshly milled flour for my sourdough recipes, and my go-to favorites are the sandwich bread, artisan bread, and like a focaccia style pizza dough. Those are like my top three. I do rotate recipes. I will make English muffins or bagels using freshly milled flour, but those are like my remakes like every week. We like to restock our freezer with bread pretty much on a weekly basis. So yeah, those are our top three favorites, I would say. Sometimes I'm craving, like hamburger buns, and if, I try to have a baking day where I can make all of this bread. I feed my starter, I have a ton of starter, I make multiple recipes, and yeah, I just bake all the breads I need. So those would be like my everyday type of breads, but I do love cinnamon rolls with sourdough and freshly milled flour. That's a really, really good one. And yeah, we make a lot of things with sourdough and freshly milled flour, so I mean, the sky is the limit.
Do you make your Subway bread with that?
I haven't tried that with, that's a yeast recipe, but
Yeah.
I should try grinder, the Subway bread, with freshly milled flour and sourdough. You just have to do a longer rise time. Sourdough works much longer than like dry active yeast, so you'd have to count that in. Give yourself that time to let the dough ferment.
Is it possible to make fluffy sourdough bread using freshly milled flour?
Yeah, it is. The key to fluffy bread is to have the dough like on the tackier side, like on the stickier side. You don't want to add too much flour, and usually fermenting and hydrating the dough really helps you not to add too much flour, because it's different. It's kind of different from your typical knead recipes where you kind of look at the dough and you're like, okay, this is sourdough tends to be more stickier, so you can stretch and fold it, and it kind of develops that gluten, which will give you fluffiness, during fermentation. So it is absolutely possible to make fluffy bread. Our sandwich bread is really, really fluffy, and it is like a stickier dough. I like to bake it in parchment paper, and that one is really soft and fluffy. Yeah, you could add wheat gluten too. That usually adds that stretchy consistency to your dough, elasticy consistency to your dough. But it's not necessary. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about sourdough, is that you could just let it ferment, let it do its thing, and it just develops the gluten from fermenting. So yeah, I have been really enjoying sourdough and freshly milled flour. You can make really soft and fluffy dough. Like I said, the key is to make the dough on the stickier side, and using sourdough is really forgiving, as it will develop the gluten during fermentation. And if you want to use a stand mixer, you just have to knead it for quite some time, like about 25 minutes, and to just allow the bread to do its thing. Let it ferment, it'll develop the gluten, do some stretch and folds to help with that. And yeah, and just, it's mostly hands off, and I love that. I love that I can just mix up the dough, put it aside, work on my other things that I need to do in the kitchen, and I come back to it and it's all ready to go, and I just shape it into whatever loaf I need. I give it another rise, and yeah, it rises and it bakes beautifully, and yeah, it's totally attainable. Fluffy bread is totally attainable.
Is your bread sour at all?
So it depends. If I do an overnight fridge rise, then it tends to be a bit more sour. But usually I like to bake on the same day. So I'll feed my starter early in the morning, and it'll be ready to bake sometime in the evening. And that one is not sour. I also think it depends on your sourdough starter, really. If you have a good fed sourdough starter that is being used throughout the week, I feel like that one, it shouldn't be too sour. Your bread shouldn't be too sour. If you have a hungry starter, I feel like that might be, your bread might be too sour.
How long is the maximum time you should ferment bread?
So usually I try to aim for 8 hours. 8 hours is probably the maximum time. From the time that I mix up the dough to the time that I bake it, it's usually 8 hours. If I'm doing an overnight, like fridge ferment, then I will give my bread about 4 hours to ferment before I hide it into the fridge. So yeah, so 8 hours is like my maximum. I do not try to go beyond that because it will release liquid and it'll be like very hard to work with. You do not want to over ferment it. If you see that you're not going to be able to bake that bread that day, I would just hide it, put it in the fridge, and work on it tomorrow. That's also another really good thing about sourdough is that you could always go to it, come back to it later. Like you don't have to work with it that day. But yeah, I wouldn't go over 8 hours, and yeah, 4 hours is a good time from the time you mix the dough to refrigerate it.
What equipment do you use?
You don't need anything fancy. I would just recommend like a plastic container or some kind of like bowl, glass bowl that you could let the dough bulk ferment. And yeah, what else? Plastic container, a scale. A scale is a must for freshly milled flour. I have a whole blog post explaining how to convert any recipe to freshly milled flour. So you can check that out. But yeah, a scale is the key for that. Like you can convert any recipe with a scale. So a scale, my grain mill, obviously. And yeah, a good plastic container with a lid, or like a nice big glass bowl that you can just cover with a tea towel for bulk fermenting. But yeah, that's pretty much about it. Bread pans. I don't really use Benetton's. If I do make artisan bread, I usually just dust my parchment paper with white rice flour, and I place the loaf right on the parchment paper and just plop it into like a glass mixing bowl, and that keeps it from spreading so far apart and just being flat. It helps keep the artisan bread, have a little shape to it, and that isn't too flat. So I like to use just regular basic equipment, really. My scale is from the dollar store, so you can pick that up at Dollar General. If you don't want to invest into a pricey one, that does the job well. But yeah, I don't really use a mixer for sourdough. My hamburger buns and other bread recipes, other yeast recipes, I would, but not so much for sourdough. Unless you're making sourdough bagels, then you would probably want to use a mixer for that. But for sandwich bread, at least for my sandwich bread recipe, all you have to do is just let it do its thing in a container. Like you don't have to knead it. It's a no-knead recipe, really. So yeah.
Yeah, you can link the stuff in the description box if anyone's
Sure.
interested.
Yeah, I could.
Yeah. Can you freeze freshly milled sourdough bread?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I have a baking day where I just feed my sourdough starter early that morning, and I will bake all my breads that day. And I'm making like 3 sandwich loaves, 2 artisan bread, what else? Sometimes cinnamon rolls, and I do freeze my bread. I have bread bags that I buy from Walmart with the twist ties, and that's where I usually store my sandwich loaf. I like the extra long bread bags. Like if you're making a Pullman style sandwich bread, I buy my extra long plastic bags with twist ties from Bread Becker's. She has like 18 by 6 or something bread bags which is really nice for those long loaves if you make like 2-pound loaves. But yeah, it does freeze very well, and just make sure you cool your bread first before you put it into freezer bags. And yeah, and then you can freeze them. And we usually go through bread weekly, so we're usually really low with bread by the end of the week until next baking day. So yeah, it freezes really good.
Do you have to use wheat gluten?
No, you don't have to use wheat gluten. I like to use it for certain recipes like my artisan bread, because I know the bread is going to be really, really like fluffy, really good consistency. But you can totally like omit that. You don't need to use it. I made bread, my focaccia style pizza dough without it, and it turned out really nice. I think it's because it's sourdough, it's so forgiving. Like sourdough, yeah, it just develops the gluten from through fermentation. So yeah, I think you can skip it for sourdough recipes.
If you would want to do wheat gluten, where could you buy it?
I get my wheat gluten from Azure Standard, like in 5-pound bags. I can link it in the description box.
Okay. Do you have to need sourdough bread?
Do you have to need sourdough bread? No, you do not. My sandwich bread recipe is a no-knead recipe. That it just requires some stretch and folds. You don't even have to do stretch and folds. I've done that bread. I've done my sandwich bread by just mixing it, and yeah, overnight. And I would just go to bed, and it would bulk rise, and in the morning I would just shape it into loaves and bake it that day. So yeah, absolutely, you don't have to knead bread. I do recommend kneading for certain recipes. Like if the dough is tough, like bagel dough, it's tough, so I feel like it's good to knead that. But other than that, yeah, you don't need to.
Do you offer sourdough classes?
No, I don't, but I have blog posts with step-by-step pictures to help someone if they do want to make some bread, and it's all for free. It's at alonascooking.com, so yeah, if anybody wants to, see a tutorial, that's a good place to start.
Will you be posting more sourdough recipes?
Yes. Yep.
Your focaccia pizzas one?
Yeah, that one is going to be coming up on the blog next. But yeah, I really enjoy sourdough baking, and doing it with freshly milled flour is really nice. It makes me happy. I love it when I accomplish something that seems to be so,
That a lot of people find it hard or something.
Yeah.
Or they're like,
Yeah, like when I even got on my whole wheat journey, I was just like, oh, how am I gonna make this work? My loaves weren't turning out, and they would come out dense, but yeah, once you get a good recipe and you make, whole wheat bread that is super fluffy and that you really like, then it kind of drives you to go further and further. And yeah, now we're doing sourdough bread with freshly milled flour, and that is a big progress. Like I would have never known I would get to this point of baking, and yeah, and I really enjoy it. So yes, more sourdough recipes to come.
Yeah, can you make anything using whole wheat flour, or is it certain things?
As in,
like for baked goods, can you just use
with sourdough or
just with whole wheat flour?
Oh yeah, you can pretty much make anything.
Do you have any tips for whole grain sourdough?
Yeah, just figure out a schedule that works for you. So before, overnight schedule worked for me better, but now I'm shifting more towards feeding my sourdough starter in the morning and just working on my dough in the evening, like baking it in the evening. That seems to suit me better now. But yeah, figure out a routine that works and stick with it. And I like to have enough sourdough starter so I can make at least like 3 recipes or more. So I'll feed my sourdough starter with 2 cups of heaping flour, like about 2 cups of heaping flour, and about 2 cups of water, like a pancake consistency. and it just rises so nicely. I've been keeping it in a plastic jug, and it works just fine. I know glass is probably better, but I really don't want to risk losing my sourdough starter to broken glass. So yeah, that's why I keep it in a plastic container. And it's because that's what was lightweight for the amount of sourdough starter that I had at that time. And it just, yeah, it just worked. It's really easy to handle, take out of the fridge, put in the fridge, because it's lightweight. It's, you know, glass is much heavier.
Have you worked with rye or any other type of grain?
Yes. So my top grains that I like to work with is hard red and hard white. I did work with rye before, but I prefer rye more in the starter. Like sometimes I make a sponge. The night before I make my freshly milled flour dough recipe, and that seems to work very well. But I feel like if you add it directly into the dough, you have to add a little amount, because it's a little bit, rye is a little tricky. If you over knead it, it tends to be very, very sticky. And if you use too much of it, it can make the dough, like the sourdough bread, like rip apart. So I would my recommendation is to just use like a small amount of rye flour if you're using it directly into the dough. But if you're making a sourdough starter or feeding a sourdough starter with rye, then I would definitely go for it, because rye is actually really good for like a starter or a sponge. I feel like rye works much better in that way than it would by adding it into the dough. But yeah, just if you do add it to the dough, just make sure you're not over kneading it.
Do you have a beginner's bread that you would recommend to someone that's starting out?
Yeah, the sandwich bread is definitely like a beginner's level. You don't not have to use a mixer. You just mix it all together in a container, and yeah, and it bulk rises in there, and you stretch and fold it if you want to in there, and it's so forgiving. You could just leave it on the counter overnight. You just mix it together. I do let it rest. I do let the dough rest for 30 minutes before adding the salt, honey, and coconut oil, and that like hydrates it really, really well. And yeah, you definitely don't want to skip that step. I feel like it really helps with the dough to make soft, fluffy sourdough bread. So yeah, that one is a beginner. And the artisan bread. The artisan bread only has like a few ingredients. It's just like flour, salt, and water.
Yeah, that bread and your sourdough toast bread, that one's probably my favorite one.
Yeah.
Those two are probably my favorite.
Yeah, the toast bread is the sandwich bread that she's referring to. We really like that.
Butter and jam, it's so good. Like toast and just like butter and jam. That one's probably. And your cinnamon rolls. Those are probably my favorite.
Yeah.
But yeah. What kind of sourdough starter do you have?
So I feed my sourdough starter with unbleached King Arthur flour. That has been working the best for me. I've had a whole wheat sourdough starter that I don't have anymore, but that one seemed to be much weaker. I feel like my sourdough starter is so much stronger with unbleached white flour for some reason. I am curious to try a all rye, whole wheat sourdough starter, but yeah, I haven't gotten to that. But so my sourdough starter comes from my aunt. She actually asked a Wisconsin baker to give her some, and he lended her some, and it's a really good, strong sourdough starter. I mean, he uses it at his bakery. And yeah, and that's how it got passed down to my mom, and then I got it from my mom, and so I've been maintaining it since. It's probably been about 4 years that that I had that starter, and we've sold lots of sourdough starter. Yeah, and we've sold it locally too. We have a farm stand outside, and locals have picked it up as well. Yeah. It's a really good starter. I really, really enjoy it. And yeah, it gets the job done. Yeah.
That wraps up our Q&A. If you guys have more questions, feel free to put them down in the comments, and yeah, maybe we'll have to do a part 2 sometime.
Yeah, maybe.
Anyway,
All right.
have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.